Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 267. In a case of it never rains but it pours, not only am I still getting over that head cold, but I also had to have a wisdom tooth out, so if my voice sounds a little bit slurred or anything, I apologise. I'm doing my best, and hopefully that will pass soon enough. Anyway, this week the questions are taken from guides 328 and 329, that's the guides to ARA La Argentina and USS Pueblo, along with the Wednesday videos about the initial Dardanelles naval assault and the Crimean naval war at sea in the Black Sea, and basically every theatre that wasn't the Baltic. So, let's begin. David Letter asks, the leap from the Leander class to the Town class seems quite the quantum leap. You've suggested La Argentina would make a good basis for an improvement to the Leanders before. Do any other intermediate designs for UK light cruisers with 6-inch guns exist between the Leanders and the Towns? Was there anything planned like a Brooklyn type, or is this intermediate design area between the Leanders and the Towns just taken up by the Didos or Didos? Well, we've got the Didos and the Arethuses actually, even though they're even smaller than the Leanders, they post-date them in an effort to get even more hulls out of even less displacement. But it is quite interesting to look at the various design options that were considered, or at least some of them. So there was actually a La Argentina style 3-triple version of the Leander considered, but when it was considered, well, it was actually considered twice. Once in the early stages of the Leander design, when the target tonnage was a bit lower, and therefore it was considered not quite feasible to fit everything in. Unfortunately, by the time they'd realised they were going to have to go with a slightly higher tonnage for the Leanders, they'd got locked in on 4 twins, when on the higher tonnage, 3 triples would actually have been completely workable. But there you go. And then subsequently, while they were looking at the Arethuses and potential follow-on Leanders, they again looked at 3 triples, but they decided for speed it would be better to go for 4 twins again, so that was the Amphions, which eventually ended up mostly going to Commonwealth navies. The Arethuses, which obviously had 3 twins in the end, they actually looked at having them with either 2 triples instead of 3 twins, so you still have the 6-gun armament, so they'd almost be like miniature 6-inch Deutschlands. They also looked at a kind of super destroyer dash very small cruiser of between 3,000 and 4,000 tons, and there was some debate as to whether that should have single mounts or twins. And then when they began to realise that perhaps these small cruisers weren't going to match up to the other 6-inch cruisers that were beginning to be ordered, there was a look at an improved Arethusa class, which had its lower twins replaced by triples, so that would have made it an 8-gun design, but with a twin superfiring over a triple forward and a triple aft. And there was also a look at an improved Leander, which would have been a 10-gun design, which, similar to the improved Arethusa, would have replaced the lower turrets with triples, but obviously since the Leander also had the superfiring twin aft, it would have had 2 triples with twins superfiring over both. And you have the various designs that were evolved for the Dido class, which are a completely separate field of things, but then you wind up with the Town class. At no point between the Leander and Town class being arrived at did there seem to be a desire for a 15-gun design like Brooklyn, mainly because even the 12-gun Town came out of a design that was looking at potentially having no torpedoes and just the 12 guns on something like 7,500 to 8,000 tons. Plus, the British habit of having the aircraft hang amidships meant that there was less centerline space, and once it was realised that they were going to have to go for sort of 9,500 to 10,000 tons to get a fully workable 12-gun ship, they wanted to put torpedoes in, which again took up weight and space. The first time you see a ship that's armed Brooklyn style is when they're actually looking at the initial design studies for Belfast and Edinburgh, and they briefly consider adding a 5th triple turret, which would have been stacked up front, Dido style, so you would have had 3 turrets, one on top of the other, all super firing, but they decided fairly quickly that they would have to lengthen the hull quite considerably to accommodate this, which then led them down the idea of having 4 quads instead, and they did get a 4-quad turret, or the quad turret design working, it just wasn't able to maintain the rate of fire that the triples could, which meant that although a theoretical Belfast with 4 quads, aka in World of Warships the Plymouth, had a heavier single broadside in terms of total rounds per minute. Because that quad turret fired slower, the 4 triple design would actually catch up and overhaul it in terms of rounds per minute downrange. JB Explicit asks, what would the crew or operator of a landing craft do after unloading troops or supplies? I don't imagine they could just reverse and return to the fleet. It depends on the size of the landing craft and, of course, the operation they're partaking in. But the smaller ones actually did quite often reverse off and head back to the fleet. That's partly because if you were timing your amphibious assault correct, you would try and time it to be on a rising tide. And there's a few reasons for that. Firstly, a rising tide, obviously the beach length is going to be shorter, which means you hopefully incur fewer casualties because you've got less distance to cover. Secondly, if the enemy has put beach defences out, then if you go in on the rising tide, maybe 3/4 of the way through the tide, you might just be able to sail over some of them, especially the ones that have been put down further on the beach. And also, it means that when you land, you offload your troops, but because the tide is constantly coming in relatively short order, you should be floated off if you've grounded. And of course, if you've got a bunch of troops and maybe some light vehicles on board, simply unloading those might reduce your draft sufficiently that you can just back off immediately. Now, of course, if you're talking about the larger stuff like the LCTs, those are going to be usually driving themselves ashore quite heavily, and they are considerably more massive. So whilst they can reverse themselves off, in fact, LCTs actually had a whole effectively kedge anchoring system where they had a fairly hefty anchor at the stern that could be taken out further back and then winched in once it was embedded in the seabed, which would allow them to pull themselves off and go off to reload and come back again. The simple fact is, for some of the larger ones, their amount of supplies, the amount of vehicles or men they might have aboard would take considerably longer to unload, in which case, they're not going to immediately reverse and return to the fleet, although, as just mentioned, they did have the capacity to do that if they could unload quickly enough, or if the unloading time took so long that perhaps the tide was falling, or they were just a little bit more stuck than they'd counted on, again, depending on what kind of beach they'd landed on. Danger Moosey asks, we always talk about what happens when a naval shell hits its target, but what happens to the shell if it misses its target? Does it explode on impact with the water, or does it have the same physics effects as a bullet? In most conditions, a shell that hits the water will detonate, but it depends on what kind of shell to determine what kind of detonation you get. So an HE shell, which obviously is designed to pretty much detonate on contact, will, shockingly enough, detonate on contact because, well, if you've ever hit the water doing a belly flop from a high diving board, you know that water hurts. Water doesn't get out the way too quickly, so if you've got a shell that's coming in at several hundred, possibly even over 1,000 miles an hour, depending on the range, hitting the water is like hitting concrete. It's going to be more than enough to set that shell off. Now, there are a few caveats to that. Obviously, for an AP shell, water is significantly less dense and significantly less resistive than block of steel, so although it will initiate the fuse, the shell will travel a reasonable distance, you're talking tens of feet, through the water before it detonates. And obviously an AP shell has a smaller amount of explosive on board, so it's kind of a trade-off. An HE shell will have more explosive, theoretically should create a bigger plume of water, but detonates pretty much on contact, which means there's relatively little water above the shell to be chucked up in the air. Whereas an AP shell detonating far deeper under the water, there's a lot more water for its explosive to throw into the sky, but there's a less powerful explosion. So swings and roundabouts, really. However, there is a third option, which is a shell hitting the water, particularly an AP shell. And if the shell isn't really designed for travelling through the water, it will usually begin to tumble. Not all the time, but a number of different types of shell forms, as well as at certain impact angles, they will begin to violently tumble. That can, in certain circumstances, cause the fuse to become inert. or put the fuse out while it's in its, fractions of a second of running. That can result in the shell just plunging away into the depths as a complete dud. Or, if it's a shortfall shell near a ship, it might end up going a lot deeper than it would before it should ordinarily detonate, and then obviously bypassing the armour and fetching up inside the ship, although the fact that it's been able to do so is because it's not going to explode, so you don't get the explosion that theoretically should follow. Prince of Wales being hit below the waterline by Bismarck is an example of that kind of behaviour. At very shallow angles, shells can also skip off the water. Again, referencing Bismarck, in the final battle of Bismarck, Rodney's shells from her 16-inch guns were observed at least once or twice to skip across the ocean because her guns were at very minimal elevation. And of course, you also have to remember that just because a shell has missed you doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be completely free from damage. If the shell is close enough, the transmitted shock might still cause damage to your ship, particularly to torpedo defences, which aren't really designed to do much other than crumple in the face of high-intensity energy pulse. And you are also going to end up with splinters being propelled both above water, which might travel further and cause superficial damage up top, and some larger fragments that obviously won't go quite as far, but again, if it's a near miss, might still impact into the side of the ship and cause you problems. And in fact, shell and bomb splinters from near misses puncturing through the relatively thin hulls of destroyers was a major problem for most destroyer classes in World War I and World War II, because it meant that even a near miss could set off some pretty nasty leaks. PK Zhang asks, how much damage could World War II-era Japanese or British torpedoes have inflicted if they'd used Torpex instead of enriched TNT mixtures for their warheads? Well, obviously somewhat more. There are a few things that make it difficult to quantify precisely, though. Firstly is the fact that in the latter part of World War II, a lot of British torpedoes did actually move over to using Torpex, or some of the later introduced ones in the war actually just used Torpex straight up from the get-go. So, they used Torpex, they were as effective as they were. When it comes to other British torpedoes, though, so the earlier air-launched torpedoes that were obviously used in the first part of the war, if you replace their TNT warheads with Torpex warheads, they become about as powerful, roughly speaking, as the Mark 15, which was the late war Torpex-filled unit, if the Mark 15 was using TNT, because the Mark 12, which is the oldest British aerial torpedo, and also, to be honest, the Mark 14, which wasn't used much at all thanks to the loss of Singapore, they both used about 370 to 380 pounds of TNT. So considering that Torpex is about 50% more powerful, you're talking about the equivalent of about 550 to 600 pounds of TNT. And the Mark 15 uses 545 pounds of Torpex. Or if you want to put it yet another way, it would have made the early war British aerial torpedoes hit with about the same power as a German U-boat torpedo, whilst Torpex allowed the Mark 15, despite being an 18-inch torpedo, to hit with about the same power as a lot of other countries' heavier weight surface and sub-launch torpedoes. Whilst the good old Mark 8, the submarine launch torpedo for the most part in World War II, its warhead originally was about 720 pounds of TNT, later had 800 pounds of Torpex, so if they were using the original version with the sort of just over 700 pounds of TNT, you'd be looking at, and obviously looking also at the later, you're actually looking at a warhead that is slightly more powerful than the warhead of a long lance, which had a pretty hefty warhead. So, yeah, that could make a difference early on in the war when you have some of these Mark 8 torpedoes smacking into things like the sterns of German Panzerschiff. That shift in explosive power may have turned it from make the stern collapse to make the stern fall off altogether and cause considerably more flooding. Or going back to the aerial torpedoes, it would have meant that Bismarck, when it was hit by the Swordfish dropped aerial torpedoes, would have been taking the equivalent of full-sized surface launch torpedoes from its own side instead of the lighter weight aerial warheads. For the Japanese, obviously, the Long Lance already has over 1,000 pounds of explosive, so making it closer to 1,500 pounds of explosive if you're using TNT as a baseline, yeah, that's scary. The Long Lance could do a tremendous amount of damage already. Being able to do even more damage, well, perhaps a number of the ships that made it away with large portions of themselves blown away might not make it away anymore. But you've also got the aerial torpedoes again, and with that it becomes a lot more difficult to work out, because unlike the British, who essentially just, for all intents and purposes, are using two variants of aerial torpedo, the Japanese have quite a few, and their warhead ranges are considerable. So early in the war, G3M bombers are dropping a variant of the 17.7-inch Type 91 air-launched torpedo that has about 330 pounds of explosive, which with Torpex would be equivalent to about 450 pounds of TNT, still well survivable by most decent torpedo defense systems, although some of the lesser ones might be strained, and the refit ships from World War I as well. But then it gradually escalates. There's a version with about 450 pounds, another version with about 530 pounds, all the way up to the very last variants of the aerial drop torpedo, which actually are almost pushing 1,000 pounds of conventional explosive. So they're almost, not quite, but almost as powerful as a Long Lance. And with that kind of range, you're talking about one of the biggest torpedoes having almost 3 times the warhead of the smallest air-launched torpedoes. You've got to try and figure out which particular version of the 7 different types were actually used on a particular target to ascertain exactly how much of a difference it would make. Because if you're using some of the smaller types, let's say for the sake of argument, with about 500 pounds or less of conventional explosive, and changing that for Torpex, then that's going to test modern fast battleship torpedo defense systems in the US Navy quite severely, but theoretically should still be survivable. Whereas if you're talking about some of the later ones that have almost 700, or as I said, almost 1,000 pounds of explosive on board already, and you switch that up for Torpex, then those things, they're going to be more lethal with the Torpex warhead than the original Long Lance would be. And then, as we said, the original Long Lance and other surface-based torpedoes become even nastier. Alexei asks, I watched your Washington Naval Treaty video, and I saw the treaty did allow France and Italy to upgun their old battleships to 16-inch. If both are financially and technologically capable of developing a 16-inch, does the Caerdwylio or Cavour class be able to be refitted with it? Perhaps it might end up with only 6 guns in an Admiral Graf Spee type layout. The Britannias seem to be a bit too small for that refit. Well, although the Italian ships are in a slightly better position, they both run into a little bit of a problem, because you have the general rule of thumb of, if you're upgrading or downgrading guns, of 2 inches equals 1 gun. So if you upgrade from, let's say, 14-inch guns, you could go from 414 to 316s, because you're increasing by 2 inches, dropping a gun, or vice versa. If you have a quad 14 and you want to go down to 12-inch, going down 12-inch, you can add a gun, you can get a quintuple 12-inch on there for approximately the same barbette width. Now, for the Britannias, they have 13.4-inch guns, which is somewhat larger than the Italian guns, so that puts them in a little bit of a good starting position, but unfortunately the Britannias only have twin turrets. So if they go up by 2 inches to 15.4, it's close enough that you could probably just about edge up to 16 without too many concerns, but you're dropping a gun, so you've gone from 2 guns to 1, and yeah, putting 5 single 16-inch turrets along the centre line of a Britannia, that's really, really not going to work. You could go in for an Italian-style full rebuild, perhaps, and get maybe twin 16s in, you would, like the Italians, have to sacrifice the center gun, the center turret. And with the Britannia specifically, they do have this 5.5-inch gun battery immediately abreast both the fore and aft sets of guns. So in theory, you might, with a complete overhaul and rebuild, be able to get 4 twin 16s in if you basically strip out most of the secondary battery as well as that central turret. But you're going to be pushing very, very close to the outer edges of the hull, so I don't think it's actually practical, even if technically speaking the surface area might be there. You might actually be better off doing a Graf Spee style layout, so you'd have to cut down some of the superstructure as well, eliminate all of the gun turrets, completely rebore and enlarge what had been the super firing barbettes fore and aft, and then you might be able to get a close packed triple 16 in where the super firing 13.4-inch were. So you get 6 guns, but again, you're probably going to be cutting it a little bit fine. You'd have to be stripping out the secondary battery as well. Now with the Italians, obviously their ships have 3 triple turrets as well as 2 twins, so the twins are even in a worse state than the French ones because they're 12-inch to start with, so the rule of thumb would suggest they can go up to 14, not 16. The triples, I mean, yeah, you've got 2 guns to lose, but again, you're starting off with the 12-inch gun, so if you go up 2 inches to 14, lose a gun, you go up 2 inches again to 16, lose a gun, you're actually in the same position as the French. And so I think, kind of like what you said in your questions, kind of what I suggested with the Britannias, you might end up having to scrap all of your turrets, so the central turret becomes more engine power as per the original refit. And again, if you take out both the twin and the triple 12, and instead of reboring them, completely bore out and reposition your magazines and shell hoists and have, again, a Graf Spee style triple 16 forward, triple 16 aft, you might just about get away with it, especially if it's sighted mostly over where the super firing turret was. But again, you're going to be pushing your barbette width out somewhat uncomfortably close to the edges of the hull. So you're going to have suboptimal protection from incoming shell fire, at least compared to ideal. Then we have, why didn't the Japanese convert Ises and Fusos into carriers and continue to build the Tosas and Amagis? Did the naval treaties allow for such a plan? And if they did go ahead with it, would it be effective? The main reason they didn't go ahead with it was because the treaties did not allow for such a plan. The treaties specifically had an exemption to allow the conversion of oversized ships into carriers, which is where you got Lexington and Saratoga, and you were supposed to get Akagi and Amagi, but ended up with Amagi and Kaga thanks to the Great Kanto earthquake. But the treaty had no allowance, apart from grandfathering in Hood, for the construction, post-signature of the treaty, of treaty-breaking battleships, or battle cruisers, and both the Tosa and Amagi classes were far, far above the 35,000-ton standard displacement limit, so they were never going to get completed under the treaty system as full capital ships. If somehow they managed to get the other signatory nations to agree to that, let's just hand wave and say that they do, would it be particularly effective? Well, it would give them somewhat more effective capital ships. Amagi and Akagi would be pretty handy, as, you know, ships armed with 10, 16-inch guns, pretty quick, not the world's best armoured, to be perfectly honest, and the Tosas just being a slightly better armoured but slightly slower variant thereof. But combine that with Nagato and Mutsu, that gives you a full 16-inch armed battle line, plus the Congos off helping the cruisers and destroyers prior to the introduction of the Yamato. So it would make their surface battle line a little bit more effective if they actually ended up fighting any kind of major surface actions, which, of course, the Japanese battle line units didn't. So, an on-paper improvement, but a practical, considerable drop in effectiveness. Now, as far as converting both the Ises and Fusos into carriers, well, looking at our best case scenario, the Ise class, they are 6 foot narrower and over 80 foot shorter than the Tosa, and the Tosa, which the Tosa class cargo gave us, the aircraft carrier cargo, was not considered an ideal conversion by the Japanese anyway. As we mentioned, it was only really done because of the Great Kanto earthquake. Also, the baseline speed for the Ises and Fusos is considerably less as well. And then when you look at the Fusos, they're even shorter vessels. So you're going to end up with considerably slower and considerably less capable carriers, because they're going to have narrower, shorter hangar decks, shorter flight decks, not capable of going quite so fast, so they can't get aircraft to take off quite as well because they can't get the speed up relative to the wind. So they're just generally a lot less capable vessels. On the other hand, you do have 4 flight decks instead of 2, so I suppose that's useful. It does give the US 4 targets instead of 2 to go after. But when you consider the overall dimensions, the Fusos effectively would make something approximating HMS Eagle only 20 to 30 foot longer. And you can look at Eagle statistics and realize that, okay, so that probably means you're carrying 35 to 40 aircraft, maybe a bit more if you deck park them. And obviously, yeah, the Ises will carry slightly more, so maybe properly 50 or so aircraft. And that may be being slightly generous, because Hio and Junyo, which were obviously converted out of liners, they're actually a bit longer. They're by 40 to 60 feet. And they're only carrying in the mid-40s of aircraft in World War II. Now, granted, they are also about 5 to 10 foot narrower, so maybe you squeeze some aircraft back in that way, but you'd be compensating for the fact they're shorter as well. So, based on something like Hio and Junyo, you'd essentially actually have 4 carriers pretty similar to Hio and Junyo, just looking slightly different, but having a 45, 46-ish air complement, which means a total air complement of about just over 180, which means, okay, you have slightly more aircraft than Akagi and Kaga did historically, spread across 4 flight decks for greater survivability, but on platforms that are going considerably slower, which, as we said, will limit your utility, with smaller magazines, smaller fuel stores, and a lot less efficiency. Gary Stew asks, during World War II, what happened to surviving sailors after their ships were sunk, damaged, or otherwise put out of commission? Were they simply reassigned individually as needed to other ships, or were they transferred in groups or even en masse? How orderly was this process, and how did it differ between nations? There was actually a lot more difference within nations, even within a given conflict like World War II, than there were between nations, because it depended partially on the number of survivors and what state they were in, and also partially on need. Because obviously if a ship gets blown up and there's a tiny handful of survivors, like Hood, for example, well, you can't reassign 3 people from disparate parts of the ship as any kind of coherent block, so you're just going to end up getting reassigned pretty much on an individual basis in that case. Whereas if you have a ship that has gone down but a substantial portion of the crew was saved, then there may be people with specific skills who are needed in specific areas, so they'll be hived off. There may be people with specific requirements or injuries that may also be hived off, but the bulk of the crew constitute a mostly intact, experienced ship crew. So if you can find another ship which is vaguely similar, you would try, if you could, to move them en masse over to there. So, for example, when the Royal Navy transferred HMS Shropshire to the Australian Navy to make up for the loss of HMAS Canberra, a good chunk of the first crew of Shropshire were actually the surviving crew of Canberra. Not all of them, but a good number of them. But of course, if you don't have a new ship going out that needs a brand new crew, then you would obviously have to split the crew into different ships, different areas, depending on need. So if a ship's come in with, let's say, a bunch of its anti-aircraft gun crews wiped out because it has suffered a very severe air attack, and then another ship has been sunk and most of its anti-aircraft crews made it off because it was hit by a torpedo, then, well, you might take the anti-aircraft crew from the sunken ship and put it on this ship that needs the anti-aircraft crew, but what's left of the engineering crew might need a little bit more leave before they would be dispersed to other ships, and the command and gunnery crews might be sent to still other ships. And again, in a reflection of need over any specific policy, for example, when HMS Belfast was mined, and obviously went into dry dock for an extended period, a minimum core component of her crew were kept around to supervise the repair work and keep the systems operating, or get them into maintained operating condition once they were fixed, but a good portion of the crew were sent off to other duties, but this was done almost on a department-by-department basis, so little known fact of history, but the crew of Belfast contributed a good chunk of their gunnery crew, their main gunnery crew, to another ship that had just come out of a quick refit, which was HMS Hood. So a good number of the people who went down on Hood at the Battle of Denmark Strait in her 15-inch gun turrets were actually formerly gunners on HMS Belfast in the early part of the war, which is why, as one of the survivors noted, there was never a huge number of early World War II HMS Belfast gunners around for survivors meetups, because the ones who were around were basically the ones who had either been on the ship incredibly briefly and left for other duties before it hit the mine, or some of that group who had been retained aboard the ship, very small number, to supervise the guns as they were being fixed after the mining incident. Brendan Buersdorf asks, what was the reason that the Russian Navy was so far behind other countries in Europe, especially in the era of steam and the age of sail? Was it lack of interest or lack of technology? It was a situation that waxed and waned during those periods, albeit, as you say, for the most part, the Russian navies tended to be slightly behind. And it's essentially because Russia, as with pretty much every other European power, had to split its attention between land and sea. However, unlike somewhere like France, which had a rather long-running historical enmity with Britain, and Britain was right next to it, and also France had a significant overseas empire and a significant coastline, a lot of which was right next to Britain, Russia, especially in this time period, has huge surface area, but relatively minimally accessible coastline. You know, you've got a few tiny ports up in the north, at this point, the age of sail and early age of steam, which ice over half of the year. You've got the Baltic, which ices over part of the year. You've got various holdings in the Black Sea, which don't ice over, but are also somewhat contained by the fact you don't get along with the Ottomans and they hold the Bosphorus. And then you've got the other end, 8 time zones away, where virtually nobody lives. So given that, and the extensive land borders that they have with European powers who have a habit of coming over to invade them, or occasionally the Russians have a habit of going out to invade other people, it meant that, unlike, as I said, France or Spain, Russia is going to always have to divert a considerably larger portion of its efforts into a land-based military rather than a sea-based military. And that, of course, is going to lessen the amount of investment both in numbers of ships and in technology for those ships. Now, occasionally, when emphasis on the Navy was put in, and over a long period of time, investment was put in to infrastructure and so forth, they could come up with some pretty decent designs and catch up with everybody. So there was obviously a series of quite vicious wars with Sweden in the Baltic. They did obviously have shell-firing ships and some quite large first rates during the Crimean War. Then in the Age of Steam, they would occasionally buy in expertise to, get their ships up to, roughly speaking, modern standard, and they did come up with some rather interesting things. You got the Rurik, well, actually, most of the ships called Rurik have rather interesting technological backstories and are usually quite interesting for everybody else to look at as well. But something would inevitably draw attention, funding away, and everything would fall back into the doldrums for a good while, which would mean that although you'd have some ships that were approximately equal to their contemporaries, they would be relatively few in number, and the ships that preceded and succeeded them tended to be a little bit behind. And then once you got into the Age of Steam and things started advancing very fast, then this situation got even worse, because anyone who built even what was considered a frontline warship would find that ship rendered obsolete in 2 or 3 years. But unless you were absolutely keeping up with the frontline cutting edge, if you consider things in terms of generations, you might end up, let's say if you're Britain or France, building a ship that is 2 generations behind 8 years down the line. But if you haven't kept up with that, like, say, the Russians, you might end up with a ship that is 3-4 generations behind in that same time period. Especially so when you've got constantly evolving metallurgy and manufacturing processes which underlie a lot of the advances in these ships, because you've got to build the tools to build the factories, to build them even more tools to build the guns and the armour that you need and the engines, as opposed to before, where, at least with Age of Sail ships, it tended to be more a case of, do we have seasoned wood and can we shape and put it together in slightly more interesting and advanced ways. And of course, if you don't invest in that infrastructure, you also don't have a skilled workforce, which is why towards the latter part of the Age of Steam, the Age of Iron, pre-Dreadnought era, you see Russia either wholesale buying in ships or buying in foreign design expertise to try and keep up with everybody. Jasper Klidschnitschik, I think, asks, was the British Navy encouraged to steal instead of burn valuable provisions taken during the many raids? And how much value were they able to extract? It depends on what they come across, really. Across the entire span of time of the Age of Sail and, well into the latter part of the 19th century, the British actually go to great pains, along with some other navies, to make a distinction between private property and government property. Private property was to be respected, and if at all possible, you could buy it, whereas government property, or property that was being used actively in war, or to further warlike aims, would be summarily destroyed. This is why, for example, during the War of 1812, whilst the British were quite happy to burn Washington, they were also rather careful about not burning, or trying not to burn, areas that they viewed as private property, whilst they were perfectly happy to set fire to the White House, although only after looting the feast that was inside it. And similarly, up and down the US coast in the War of 1812, whilst they could and occasionally did seize supplies, more commonly, if they came across small villages, towns, or large farms and they wanted supplies, they'd just land and offer to buy them. And then if you refused to sell, you might have them seized anyway, but that's a separate matter. And similarly, in the Crimean War, it's partly, if it's government property, it gets destroyed. If it's private property, you try to respect it. But also, what exactly are you seizing? Because you could take small amounts of government stores, if there's some meat and fresh bread and so forth to top up your own supplies, that's perfectly fine. But things like thousands of tons or tens of thousands of tons of grain are not things that small raiding craft can really extract. Now, if it's smaller and easier to transport, like gold or big cannon or some gunpowder, or it's already loaded into a ship, then that could be taken rather than burned. But it has to be this kind of low volume, high value cargo, or as I said, already loaded onto a ship. And even then, that's limited by how many crew do you have to put together prize crews, because you could capture, let's say, a harbour with 30 fully loaded merchant ships, but if your raiding force is half a dozen corvettes, then you don't have the crew to crew 30 merchant ships. So you're going to have to choose which ones are the most valuable, or maybe which cargoes are the most valuable, move them all into the smallest number of ships possible, take 1 or 2 ships with the best cargo, and set fire to everything else. Wienweh asks, I recently learned that the German pre-dreadnought SMS Lothringen was converted into a minesweeper carrier after the First World War. Could you discuss this conversion and its possible usefulness? The conversion came about because when the war ended, after the scuttling at Scapa Flow and the seizure of what was left of the German dreadnought fleet as further reparations, the Allies allowed, in the Treaty of Versailles, for the Germans to retain 8 battleships of their last 2 pre-dreadnought classes, the Braunschweigs and Deutschlands. 6 of them could be operational, 2 could be in reserve. Now, when it came to the Deutschlands, which of course the latest ones, Pommern had been sunk at Jutland, and Deutschland had been converted to a barrack ship before the end of World War I, so they had 3 others. That meant that if they were going to have 6 operational, they needed at least 3 from the Braunschweig class, which is what they got, and that left them with 2 more Braunschweigs, the Preußen and Lothringen, and Lothringen and Preußen therefore were held to be, well, they're the ships that are going to be in reserve, but Germany couldn't really afford to keep even 6 pre-dreadnoughts fully operational all the time, given the massive reparations and damage to the economy that she'd suffered. And so there was not really much chance of Lothringen and Preußen ever coming back into active service. However, another part of the treaty had lumped the Germans with the job of dismantling all the minefields that they'd put up in the North Sea, something which they hadn't really counted on having to do quite so quickly. And in order to do that, obviously minesweepers needed to go out, but of course, back in those days, minesweepers were fairly small, short-ranged craft, so you could send out squadrons of minesweepers from German ports, but they would have limited ability to stay on station, and they would be considerably vulnerable to weather and mechanical breakdown, all sorts of things. And so instead, they took these 2 technically in reserve pre-dreadnoughts and converted them to carry the minesweepers on racks with cranes to pop them in the water. What you can see here is actually Preußen. That may be Lothringen off to the right-hand side. I'm not entirely sure. But the conversions worked to an extent. Preußen's conversion, which is the one you can actually see directly, probably didn't actually work too brilliantly. She was actually a bit too top-heavy once she was fully loaded for use, so she didn't actually really end up doing her job particularly much. But Lothringen, which would have had a similar but not identical conversion, and therefore would be less top-heavy, spent a couple of years ferrying minesweeper boats out to the various minefields and dispatching as many of the North Sea mines as she could, before by about late 1920 it was decided that the job was probably pretty much done, at which point she could be put aside and then later disposed of. As a facilitator for sweeping up minefields, she was actually a pretty good idea, because as I said, it allows you to bring these relatively small, low-endurance minesweepers out to their targets and maximise their operational capabilities. But of course, it's something that's only really going to work in peacetime, because otherwise she's a very large, rather disarmed target if it had come to wartime use. HMS Inconceivable asks, flights, batches, subclasses and types within the same class of vessel. What are the differences, and when did this start? Broadly, they're all names for pretty much the same thing, just at different times and in different navies. So for those of us who are looking mostly at the time period the channel covers, you might be most familiar with the idea of a subclass, and then batches and flights are usually more modern variants thereof. Flights being quite often used by the US Navy, batches being used by the Royal Navy these days. Type is a similar concept again that bounces back and forth between being used and not used, and you can actually technically trace that all the way back to the age of sail. But essentially what it means is that you have a design of ship, whatever that might be, and then you build a bunch of them, and you're happy with those, but then for whatever reason you either continue building a bunch to a slightly revised design, or perhaps there's a pause and then you restart production and you're building essentially the same thing. So from a distance they will look very similar, but they will differ to greater or lesser extents in the details. Now, sometimes this is actually planned, and sometimes it is done mid-production or mid-order, and sometimes there's just a whole order, but by the time, say, the first 4 are built, someone's decided, well, actually, we're going to make some changes. And so in some cases with certain classes, you can end up with a situation where post that class's service, some people will recognize that actually these ships have enough differences to constitute a separate subclass or flight or batch. But at the time, that wasn't recognized, and some people still might not recognize it, whereas obviously other times it would actually be specifically planned and known. So you can have the town class, for example, or the county class, and whether you have those as just 2 singular classes of cruisers, or you accept some of the various suggested subclasses of those types, it depends quite a lot on the level of granularity, and also whether you accept the divisions are enough to cause there to be a subclass. So, for example, the counties are sometimes divided up into the first batch being the Kents, and then subsequent subclasses thereafter. But it's very inconsistent, because it's largely down to either the navy in question or afterwards historians to try and draw a line and say this ship is substantially different enough from this other ship that we're going to call it a different batch. So if we take the county class as an example, there's a reasonable argument to say that the Kents and the Londons are somewhat different enough to be subclasses, because the London class have removed the external bulges, so they're a narrower vessel. The hull is a little bit longer as well, therefore they are a little bit faster. The superstructure has been a bit relocated and the funnels are taller. So, there's enough of a visual distinction and a construction distinction to go, okay, actually, these ships are probably separate subclasses. But then when you look at the Norfolk and Dorsetshire, the last 2, which are often called the Norfolks, they are extremely similar to the London subclass. Yes, the superstructure is slightly altered. They have a different type of gun mounting for the main guns, but it still is an 8-inch twin mounting, and the AA guns are in a slightly different location, but the hull, the speed, the type and number of guns, they're all the same. At which point, I would argue that it's a little bit of a stretch to call the Norfolk and Dorsetshire a separate subclass to the Londons, at least in my opinion, because there are significantly more differences between USS South Dakota, which has 2 entire 5-inch 38 twin mounts missing, and a superstructure that's been rather radically redesigned to incorporate flag quarters because she's designed as a flagship. But very few, if anyone, is going to say that South Dakota is a one-off, and then label Indiana, Massachusetts, and Alabama as the Indiana subclass. Whereas at the other end of things, the Admiral Hippers, between Admiral Hipper herself and the Seydlitz and Lutzow, the last 2 to be designed in Seydlitz cases laid down, there's a 17-foot difference in hull length, a couple of feet difference in beam, and a 1,500-ton difference in displacement, which is substantially greater a difference between Hipper and Seydlitz and Lutzow than there is between South Dakota and her sisters, or any of the counties, and yet we still call the Admiral Hippers, for some reason, a class, as opposed to, 3 completed or 5 total ships of vaguely similar ideas, but actually individually different dimensions and displacements by a considerable margin for ships that are supposed to be notionally identical. Rob Smith asks, this picks up on a couple of recent videos by Ryan etc. about submarines using thermoclines to hide from their hunters. In these videos it was suggested that whilst the US and the UK knew about this method of hiding from their hunters, the Germans and Japanese did not. I find this a bit strange and surprising, as I would have thought that any self-respecting captain would either have been instructed in their use or would have discovered their utility during evasive action. So the problem isn't so much awareness of what a thermocline is or what potential it might have. The Germans certainly were perfectly cognizant of the concealing properties of thermocline layers and exploited them where they could. For example, in the passage in and out of Gibraltar. For one thing, the current runs in different directions at different depths through the Straits of Gibraltar, but also there is a relatively permanent thermocline layer, which, if you happen to be going in the right direction, you can exploit to obviously minimize the chance of somebody detecting your passage. However, that's with a thermocline where its location and approximate depth is relatively consistently known. The problem between knowing about something and being able to exploit it on a more general basis comes in the fact that in order to work out where the thermocline is in any particular location, you have to have a way of sensing the exterior temperature of the water. That can be, and the salinity as well if you're using a densimeter. But generally, the easiest and quickest way of working out that you're passing through a thermocline layer is something called a bathythermograph, which is essentially a thermometer that works underwater at great depth. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's the short version. Now, of course, the other problem is having a submarine that can actually dive deep enough to hit the thermocline, which is a separate issue entirely. But when it comes to even being able to detect that you have passed through a thermocline, the bathythermograph was made properly practical right at the very end of the 1930s in the USA. And so during World War II, it was the US Navy's submarines, and by extension the submarines of the navies that it was allied with, who also had access to the technology, who could fit bathythermographs to their subs and thus exploit thermoclines if they could dive deep enough to find them in various areas. Because, of course, outside of fixed points like Gibraltar, whether there's a thermocline at all, and if so, at what depth, and how many of them there might be, will vary depending on time of day, time of year, and numerous other factors. So it's less that the Germans and Japanese didn't know about the method, it's more that the US and UK had the technology that allowed them to, if they chose to and had the capability to, actually exploit it at will. Patrick Donnelly asks, there seems to be this alternate history myth around the Battle of Midway that had Halsey been the officer in tactical command instead of Fletcher, he would have run his carriers into the guns of the Japanese fleet on the night of the 4th to 5th of June. Can you explain where this could have come from and what your own thoughts are on it? So it comes from a combination of facts in the aftermath of the Battle of Midway. So, thanks in part to being a relatively cautious officer, and also in part due to the fact that there were a few misleading reports about the Japanese still going after Midway Island in terms of trying to physically invade it, Spruance, because bear in mind by this point Fletcher had ceded operational control to him, decided to pull the US carriers back east overnight instead of pressing west against what you would otherwise think would be a retreating enemy. The theory goes that had Halsey been in command, obviously being much more aggressive and having considered that he'd won the daytime carrier action, Halsey would potentially have pressed onwards to the west in order to try and hunt down the remaining Japanese ships the next day. Where the problem comes in this alternate history is the fact that although what was left of the Kido Butai's escort force was in fact retreating, Admiral Yamamoto did continue east with a very heavy section of his surface forces for a while into the night. They didn't find anything because the US forces had also withdrawn to the east, and so they turned back. And then you got the next couple of days, which was the aftermath of the Battle of Midway. However, if the US forces had continued pressing west, as the theoretical Halsey might have done, then you would have ended up with Enterprise, Hornet and their escort running into potentially the Japanese surface units coming the other way, including Yamato. And, well, with the best will in the world, it's a bunch of destroyers and cruisers and a couple of carriers with little to no night fighting experience, because this is even prior to the Guadalcanal campaign, against the Japanese, who have a fair bit of night fighting expertise, and thus the disaster is theorised it would have occurred. And indeed, there was a degree of criticism in the immediate aftermath of World War II before everybody managed to get hold of Japanese records and realised what the Japanese had done that night. And the criticism was saying, Fletcher and Spruance should have gone west. In reality, if they had, they almost certainly would have lost their task force. So it's just as well they didn't. In terms of my thoughts on it, in theory, yes, Halsey is a much more aggressive commander. It is entirely within his character to go charging off after a supposedly defeated enemy. And yes, he very well could have run the US's last two operational fleet carriers at that point in the Pacific straight into the guns of Yamato. Conversely, you have to bear in mind that part of the reason that Spruance decided to haul east rather than west was because he got this slightly not very helpful and badly worded report, but still a report nonetheless, that suggested that there was a Japanese invasion force heading for Midway. In fact, it was just a quick bombardment force, but they weren't to know that. If Halsey had been told that there's a heavy surface invasion force headed for Midway, like Spruance was, there is still a fairly decent chance he would have decided, I'm going to go after those in the morning, but I don't need to be chasing after the ragged elements of an enemy fleet west. I need to be repositioning myself to hit a force that's theoretically going to be just off the shores of Midway, and so he might not have headed west based on that information. Of course, it's also entirely possible he could have decided, I'm going to go west, hit the enemy remains of the enemy fleet, and then hook back round and trap the invasion force between me and Midway. So, yeah, it could possibly have gone that way, but there are a number of other plausible alternatives where it doesn't happen that way. Brian Stevens asks, it seems the frigates were the workhorses of the Age of Sail. Is a detached frigate, as shown in Master and Commander, typical? I wouldn't necessarily say typical as in if you run into a Royal Navy warship in the Age of Sail, there's a greater than 50% chance it will be a lone frigate. But I would probably say that if you were going to run into a Royal Navy formation of any description, then if you count formations, whether they be one ship or 30 ships as a single encounter each, then in that case the detached frigate would be the most commonly encountered, but it wouldn't be the majority. And the reason for that is that the Royal Navy throughout the Napoleonic Wars, for example, which is obviously when it was at some of its largest in the Age of Sail, would typically have something in the order of between 15 and 30% more frigates than it had ships of the line. So if it had about 100 ships of the line, which was about typical for 1805, Battle of Trafalgar, and a little bit over 100 ships of the line, it had about 120 odd, maybe slightly more frigates. And then on top of that, you had loads of sloops, brigs, unrated vessels, because remember, frigates are only 5th rates and 6th rates. Now, what that means is that, there might be 800, 900 ships flying the White Ensign, but only 230 to 300 of them at any period during the Napoleonic War would be frigates and ships of the line. So you're looking at a frigate force of between 110 to 150, maybe slightly more ships in any given year. Now, each large collection of capital ships is going to need 3, 4, 5, 6 frigates for scouting and communication purposes. And then you also have frigate squadrons, whether that be pairs, 3s, 4s, 5s, 6s, escorting convoys or on longer range patrol missions. So that might easily eat up 30, 40, 50 frigates between them all. And then, of course, of your, let's say, going for the max 150 frigates, you've got a third of them in some kind of refit, repair, or working up. So that leaves you with about 40 to 50 frigates, which could be out on detached duty. And yes, then they would be either on commerce raiding, or on scouting individually, or occasionally on sole commerce defence. So rather than escorting convoys, they might be out both equally hunting enemy merchant ships they might come across, but also hunting for lone enemy commerce raiders, be they frigates, privateers, sloops, brigs, etc. So that comes back to what I said at the beginning, is that statistically the single largest group of individual units would probably be detached frigates, yes, but in terms of number of deployments total, they don't make up the majority, they just make up the single largest demographic. And finally, Jellicoe Cats asks, was the Confederacy's quest to obtain foreign-built ironclads a fool's errand? If they had managed to take delivery of the ships they ordered, would it have made any appreciable difference to the outcome of the conflict? Now, of course, as I've said before, with questions that are sort of like this one, I'm not a land-based military historian. Well, I technically live on the land, but I don't research the land-based side of military history anywhere near as much as I do the sea-based side. So, bearing that in mind, obviously with something the size of the American Civil War, there is a limited amount of effect that naval vessels can have, because you can't starve either the Union or the Confederacy into submission. They have far too much land to be able to grow crops on, for example. You can hit them economically, and also given the fact that the US at the point of the American Civil War in the 1860s is about half a decade or so, technologically speaking, behind the most advanced industrialized countries of Western Europe, you can then obviously not just cut off your enemy from foreign trade in terms of an economy, but from foreign trade in terms of the latest and greatest weaponry and supplies of weaponry at all, which obviously is what the Union were trying to do by blockading the Confederacy. Now, if the Confederates had managed to take hold of the ships that they'd ordered, they had ordered some fairly radical ships, nothing in the realm of like a 10,000, 12,000 ton ship of the line or armoured frigate or whatever it was they were calling it that particular month. So no HMS Warriors or HMS Minotaurs, etc. coming in, but things like Scorpion and Wyvern, although those are the Royal Navy names afterwards, which you can see Wyvern here, they are pretty advanced. They're ocean-going ironclads. They have single thickness armour as opposed to laminated armour, and also probably of a high quality iron, so it's considerably more effective than the multiple layers of 1-inch armour, which were characteristic of a lot of Union monitors at the time. And as you can see, they've got turrets, they've got big modern guns, and being from Europe, that means things like steel shot, slightly more powerful powder, things like that. Well, at least as long as the powder stocks last, and the shot lasts for that matter. So, as individual combatants, if you add up all of the ironclads the Confederacy had managed to order, they do make a pretty darn powerful squadron, one which could easily 1v1 their equal number of US monitors, Union monitors, and quite potentially even outmaneuver, outmatch a force that outnumbered them, bearing in mind that although the Union does build a fair number of monitors, the largest portion of the US Navy at the time is still unarmoured or only tangentially armoured, like Kearsarge ships, which ships like what would eventually become Kotetsu, Scorpion, Wyvern, etc., are more than capable of dealing with in, reasonable numbers. But there are only so many of them, and the Union can build lots of vessels compared to what the Confederacy can order. So if, hypothetically, these ships had shown up earlier, or the Confederacy had held out longer, both of which, the latter being contingent on the land warfare side of things, but for hand-wavy reasons, let's say they're all there, they can break the Union blockade. Scorpion and Wyvern showing up together, or, a hypothetical Union nightmare scenario of all the Confederate overseas ironclads that were ordered showing up together, yeah, they can break the Union blockade of Hampton Roads or any other Confederate port that they want to, which will allow merchant vessels to leave and other merchant vessels to come in, which means that the Confederacy can then trade, which means it can boost its economy, bring in advanced materials, firepower, technology, etc., etc. But is that going to win the war for the Confederacy? I don't think so, for two reasons. One, because of their limited number, there's no way the Confederate Navy, even so reinforced, can go on the offensive and counter-blockade the Union, so the Union's still going to have free access to world trade. The Union can also then, if this occurs, send out its own raiding force. I mean, they already had raiders out there, but they can send out even more ships to go and try and hunt down Confederate merchant vessels, or vessels heading to Confederate ports. And ultimately, whilst having access to more guns, better artillery, more artillery, etc., etc., might make the Confederate army somewhat more lethal, and therefore delay a Union victory, based on my, again, limited understanding of the land warfare side of things. The simple fact is that even if the Confederacy has, let's say arbitrarily speaking, using completely, picked out the air numbers, let's say it has 36 of the latest and greatest European field guns, best powder, best shot, they're all consistent, very accurate, easy to maneuver, etc., etc. Well, that's all well and good, but as far as I understand it, by the time that would realistically be occurring, the Union can show up to the same battle with 7 or 8 dozen of its own field artillery, which, okay, individually may not be quite as good weapons, but they are close enough that the fact there's 3 times as many of them more than makes up for any individual qualitative difference. So yeah, it might make things take longer, and it might mean considerably more sunken Union warships, so that's an effect on the outcome of the conflict, but it's not going to, at least as far as I know, change the overall who won element. And that brings us to the end of this week's Drydock. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening, and hope to see you again in another video soon, and hopefully either the painkillers will have kicked in, or I'll be recording the next Drydock far enough away in time that the old hole in the jaw thing has become less of an issue. Let me know if you noticed any difference in my intonation, etc. this time around. Anyway, thanks very much, and bye for now.